Gina Ochsner is a fabulist, a magical realist, a lyrical realist, a teller of ghost stories. In her work, myth and history and fable, politics and religion, and whatever in God's name it is we're doing on this earth, are sometimes so deeply intertwined that we, her readers, can't unbraid those strands, and maybe we don't even want to. In her first novel, The Russian Dreambook of Color and Flight, set in a recent time of despair, a man hurls himself from a roof in the military-industrial city of Perm and perishes, only to resurrect himself later in the story. We could call this magical realism, or we could call it faith. We could also call it fictional faith, the faith that readers are hungry for more than a mirror or a photo. Often, we crave a flight of fancy, especially when poverty and repression surround us. We also crave the pleasures of sound. In her second novel, The Hidden Letters of VELTA, a Latvian boy named Maris, with ears as large as soup bowls, is born knowing things. His mother tells him, "The ground spoke to you, and you couldn't help but hear the soil's slow heave of stones. You heard the triumph of each slender blade of grass spearing up through the mud and the restless dreams of the dead." Gina Ochsner's attention to wonders and marvels doesn't mean that she neglects comedy, reality, or a satiric line when those are in order. In The Fractious South, a story about the war in Chechnya, first published in The New Yorker, Yeltsin, on TV, raised a fist, and the people, hearing strong words that suggested purpose, words we all like to hear sometimes, clapped and shouted. In the corner of the screen, a clock kept time, the second hand ticking loudly, as if to remind us all to keep breathing. She wants to show us the militarism and violence of our world, but she also wants to show us the private struggles of Muslims, Jews, Christians, atheists, and agnostics, all looking for purpose. If they often find it in a bottle of vodka, well, that's a world of light and fancy too. Always, always, it's language that entrances her, and not just one language. Ochsner is an internationalist, a translator, a breather in of languages. I suspect it may be a little embarrassing for Gina Ochsner to hear her long list of accomplishments, awards, and acclaims, but here's one anyway, for the record. She's published 2 collections of stories. The first, called The Necessary Grace to Fail, won the Flannery O'Connor Award, and both the first and the second, called People I Wanted to Be, won the Oregon Book Award. The Russian Dreambook of Color and Flight was rapturously reviewed and went on to win the Grub Street Book Prize. Her stories and essays appear all over the place, from Image to the New Yorker, and she's received an NEA Fellowship in Fiction and a Guggenheim, and for writers, those are the biggies. In The Hidden Letters of VELTA, the big-eared Maris writes a book of wonder, which is what you could call all of Ochsner's work. Books of wonder, of color and flight, of insults hurled and laughter floated in reply, of dreams of peace. Please give a warm welcome to Gina, who will answer your questions after her reading.
So much. I am just deeply humbled and honored to be with you this evening. I'm truly excited. When Valerie emailed, I thought, wow, this is good. This is a good time. Another day. Wow. So I want to share with you something very new. I haven't shared it much. It's not collected anywhere or published. I'm really interested in the history of Oregon these days, probably because I'm getting older. And I want to know, where is it I've lived all this time? And what do people think about? What do people read in and why? So I've been researching coastal towns along the north coast of Oregon, and here's what I'm discovering. This is called Soon the Light. In the old Clatsop story, God pinched the mud of the North Oregon shore into mountains, carved rock to jagged crags. That's how he cut his hands, and his blood stained the flats of the North Plains. Every autumn, as if remembering this event, the soil north and east of Astoria pushes forth blood-bright cranberries. That's the way Yaska heard Indian Jimmy tell it anyway. Because God suffered, those who work the North Plains harvest suffer. This part Yaska could vouch for. 30 years of hauling fishing nets had pulled his chest toward his hips and put a thick hump between his shoulders. 30 years of work had turned his bones to chalk. That's the reward of hard work, Mother says in her many letters, but he knows fear has stove him up as much as the work. Not hospitable waters, 40 gill netters were lost this year alone, and it was only May. 40 reasons to content himself with his single net tied to a piling and his weir set along the quivering flats. Set netters don't drown like gill netters do, his spinster sister Kari had said on his 55th birthday. They kept house together. She cooked and cleaned, did laundry, gave advice. And so from that day on, he fished the flats where the sandbars glistened at low tide, and he could look north and west and watch the gill netters fishing the mouth where the river water met the ocean. He could look and thank God he wasn't out there with them. It's woman's work what you're doing, his friend Lasse teased. Lasse had lost a leg somewhere in France during that war, and now anything other than war or gill netting was women's work. I'm not so young, Yaska said. Yes, but you're a Finn. How can you live with yourself? I don't. I live with my sister, Yaska replied. Kari. Mother wrote to him every other week asking about her. Yaska, is she eating regular life? Is she working? Any unattached men showing interest? Yes, yes, and no. He had never written to Mother about that trouble in the woods some 30 years ago. Typical trouble single girls working in a kitchen camp might get into. But they were Finns and Lutherans. Kari should have known better. She should not have been surprised when she got pregnant or when her man, Buggy or something like, didn't rush to the altar. About the man's untimely death, cut from crotch to crown by a haulback, he never wrote. Nor did he remind Mother that Kari was 50, well past the notice of men, that she'd been measuring sugar, salt, and flour at Gunderson's for nearly 20-some years. Instead, he wrote to Mother about the 40 men lost, the desperate search by Peacock Spit, the treacherous sandbars that shipped without warning. He wrote about a man who had tied himself to the boards of his boat. He washed ashore on a single beam. His tongue hung out of his mouth, and his eyes had been pecked out. Mother possessed the unflappable Finn nature that shocked her. She lived through the lean years, she liked to remind them, the hard years in Finland that drove so many of them to Minnesota and North Dakota, where she assured them the living was easier, the winter lighter, the cold warmer. It was this Yaska thought about as he thread through the dark toward his single net and weir, the easy living in Astoria. 27 canneries, 52 saloons, 12 churches, 2 of them finished Lutheran, a movie theater, a union hall, 4 saunas. This abundance would kill a woman like Mother. All those houses painted in bold blue, rose, or yellow, set like thumbtacks, pinning the fur-covered hillsides. An excess of cheer, Mother would say. Yaska picked his way through the bull kelp. Behind the eastern hills, a long silver wrinkle widened, throbbed with light. That would be dawn. Beside the piling, his lone net lay flaccid, but the weir, the hoops of which jutted from the sand like ribs, rocked and wriggled, thrashed. Too strong for an eel or salmon, these movements. And the noise coming from the weir, too human to be anything but a child. Yaska hurried for the weir, flung open the lid. Inside, mired up to the waist in mud, was a boy. In an hour, the tide would have taken him. Stop flailing, Yaska said. He dug at the mud around the boy's waist and thighs, scooping with his trowel, cursing under his breath. A minute, 2, and then he freed first one leg and then the other to the shin. Grab tight, Yaska said. The boy wrapped his arms around Yaska's neck, his one leg around Yaska's waist. With a grunt, Yaska pulled, a loud slurp, and the mud released its hold. Yaska tumbled, heels overhead, and the child laughed. Laughed. Yaska's first thought, how shall I write about this to Mother? He figured the child to be 7, maybe 8, not from these parts, he was sure of it. How do they call you? He asked in Swedish, English, Spanish, Finnish. A chunk of horehound candy lured the boy into a metal wash tub, but you would have thought Jaska was pouring acid over him the way he jumped and squirmed beneath the pitchers of warm water poured over his back. Settle down, Jaska murmured, pouring with one hand, holding the boy in the tub with the other. Layers of bladder wrack and seaweed clung to his back and torso and limbs. More warm water, more candy, and a good long sip before the greens peeled away and the boy beneath the mud slowly emerged. Jaska rested on his heels and blinked at the creature before him. Hard to believe this was the same child pulled up from the marl, so beautiful now to behold, a cherub like something from a fine painting that belonged on a vaulted ceiling in a cathedral somewhere. If God existed, he existed in his boy. That's how beautiful the child seemed to Jaska. And yet, he could not discount the otherworldly quality of his alabaster white skin, hair white as dry clouds, eyes an odd cornflower blue. Well, did not Jonah step out of the open mouth of a whale, his skin blanched blister white? Did he not stumble upon that shore, dumbfounded and disoriented? The boy, Jaska decided, must have suffered a similar fate. We do, after all, still live in the age of miracles. Jaska pulled the boy out of the tub and rubbed a towel gently over his shoulders and back, his skinny legs, his feet. Only his feet were imperfect. One foot twisted inward at the ankle, the other foot had no arch. Kari squinted at the boy from her perch by the hearth. He could read the look in her eyes. He brought the child in. This was a mess she wouldn't clean up. Kari approached the boy, so white, this child, like he'd been drawn up from a big vat of bluing, and the eyes, dull and oddly non-reflective, like they would swallow her up in darkness. Kari bent and ran a finger along the boy's bony shin and touched the twisted foot. Someone put him in your nets. He's not right, and they wanted to get rid of him. Jaska gave the boy more candy. Does not every creature bear the image of God? Well, surely they do. Kari glanced at the hard light in the boy's eyes, not dark now, light, as if twilight sky full of stars, icy, cold, and distant, passed through them. We cannot fathom the imagination of our creative God, Jaska continued. Did not St. Paul say we are made perfect through our imperfections? Well, that's a question she spent 30 years tiptoeing around. Better to turn her hand to what can be touched and gathered and cleaned. Kari gathered the wet towels. If you're going to keep them, you ought to fit him for shoes, like those special ones they make in Portland, she said. He's fine just the way he is. Jaska scooped up the boy, flung him over his shoulder. The boy shrieked with delight as Jaska plodded up the stairs, laughed and ran his hands over Jaska's hump. In Mother's most recent letter, she made requests. Tell me the untellable story. Tell me a story that outstrips time. She wanted a love story. She wanted joy. Those are stories Kari can't tell. About love she never wrote. About Bucky she never wrote. She wrote about the woods, the way they swallowed her up. The darkness brewed within them. That was her meat, her milk, her music. Darkness, she wrote, made a clean heart in her. About her own child who lived for only a day, she never wrote. Only Indian Ginny and Leela, the pastor's wife, knew about the infant she put in the water down by the docks. Leela said, God understands all, but the look on her face said, that's what you get for chipping around with men in the woods. And sure, she was forgiven on Sunday, but Monday through Saturday, nobody wanted a thing to do with her. Those were the bad years, 30 of them to be exact, consisting of calendar days, tight schedules, letters from Mother. Mother writes, Bolsheviks, they creep through the wheat fields at night, singing Soviet hymns, good songs, lousy lyrics. Those godless Bolsheviks, they ruin all that is right and beautiful. Are there Bolsheviks in Astoria? There are, in fact, a few. The Redfins, Kari tells her, meet in a socialist hall on Front Street. They even have their own newspaper. Some of them are leaving for Karelia, a Soviet promised land in what was once a part of Finland. They are helped along by cannery bosses who are only too happy to pay their passage if it gets talk of unionization out of their mouths. Mother describes the ballet in Minneapolis. The way the girls mince about on tippy-toe baffles her. Why don't they just hire taller girls so they can walk normal-like? Mother asks. Hey, Ginny yelled from the porch. You seen my man? I looked all over for him. Her eyes roved aimlessly. Kari put the kettle on the stove. He's gone, Ginny. Yeah, but I got supper ready for him. If you see him, tell him I'm looking for him. Kari motioned to the chair in front of the stove. Come in, Ginny. Ginny dropped a large burlap sack on the porch, scraped her boots on the step, and crossed the threshold. They had to get this conversation out of the way before Ginny would come in and drink the raspberry tea Kari always kept at the stall. Indian Ginny, Bucky's Ginny. Kari wanted to hate her. Bucky had left Kari for Ginny, but Ginny was so simple these days, childlike and forgetful, and it seemed wrong to hate a child. Grief had scrambled Ginny's brains, but somehow she remembered to stand on Kari's porch at least twice a week and ask after Bucky. Kari set a mug on the table. Torger was found dead this morning. Someone set fire to his shed with him in it. Ginny reached for the mug, a loud slurp. And you know old Hans? Kari nodded. Taken off by a cougar. Ginny set the mug on the table and leaned toward the staircase. White! The child had crept down the stairs and fixed his gaze on Ginny, and Ginny shuddered. The devil is white, white, white. And reeking. The smell of marl, the rank and rot of things that wash up on the rack line, filled the room. And this after a full bath. He's lost, I think, Kari said. Yaska says he's a prophet, like Jonah. Ginny surveyed the chalk-white hair, the misshapen feet. My mother knew a prophet once. At night, he closed his eyes. His body lay on his mat, but his spirit was in the stars. He died twice. Then he came back to the living with messages from bears. Heaven is full of bears. Ginny stood and nodded toward her sack on the porch. Daffodil bulbs. We could plant them along the cow trail. We could wait for Bucky. Not the right time for planting bulbs, not on the trails, not with all the rain. So much of it that the hooves of the cows have turned up like snowshoes. Their bovine instinct for safety has kept them off the hillsides. Not so for Ginny. The hills could slide right out from under her. The mountains crumble. Nothing will keep the woman from her rituals. Let's go, Kari said to the boy, pulling on his arms. He wriggled away. Kari tried again. He sank to the floor, a heap of dead weight. Kari dragged the boy to the door. He could walk, she knew it. This was a game, and she was having none of it. Walk, she commanded, and the boy flailed and carried on with the god-awful racket that put the crows to flight. Ginny scrutinized the boy, then she hoisted him into her arms as if he were no heavier than a sack of potatoes, carried him up the trail on her short, sturdy legs, leaving the bag of bulbs for Kari. Kari followed, her gaze on Ginny's stubby legs. Ginny had the strength for hauling nets. Also, she had her own mesh boards and could tie good knots. Maybe this is what Bucky saw in her, a woman who would be at home on a boat, would work and never stop to ask why. At the trail's summit, they had a regal view of the bay to the south, and to the west and north, the shipping channel and the river's wide gray mouth. Behind them was Sugarloaf Mountain and a scabland of bare rock and spreading pine. Kari hunkered over her knees and pushed bulbs into the soft mud. Daffodils, a ridiculous prospect. Nothing grows well here. The wind and salt and stabbing rain stunted everything, bent all life on the hills to horizontal lines. Everything but the razor grass nattering and whistling, slicing the wind to jagged slivers. The boy hummed. The wildness up here seemed to calm him, but then he spied a Swedish tanker gliding along the lane, and he scowled and threw rocks over the cliff. Ginny crouched in front of the boy, her eyes sparking bright. What will you do with him anyway? As if awaiting her reply, the boy turned his gaze, primal and untainted, on Kari. The pureness of it blinded, and Kari turned her head and looked at the bay. I'd put him in the water, Ginny said. It's kinder to them that way. Then, as if touched by electricity, she straightened. Did you hear that? Bucky's calling me. Kari peered down the trail. Sure, she said, as Ginny lumbered along the path. It's a kind of love, these lies. No harm is there in weaving loose fictions. Bucky's at sea. Bucky's in the woods. Bucky is the wind. Bucky should have been a wolf, Kari tells the boy. Well, he should have been given a wolf's name. That's what you do if you want someone to live a long life. What kind of a name, after all, is Bucky? Kari reached for the boy, who allowed her to pull him up on her back. She had not named the baby. It could not have lived with or without a wolf's name. Sure, she said the prayers you were supposed to say for newborns, but what words for an infant turning blue? Then racked with a jagged breath, punching the air with tiny fists, then silence, then gone. She does not remember the weight of the other child in her arms, the sweet smell of his hair, the color of his eyes. She was tired of tending messy memories. Besides, this boy on her back was here now and needing her, and Yaska was right. He was beautiful, except for the feet, beautifully perfect. And what will we call you, she whispered, knowing he would say nothing. The boy dug his heels into her stomach, wrapped his arms tighter around her neck. The heat of his body against hers loosened something below her stomach, a liquid pressure from between her legs. Kari raced down the trail, past the hedgerow, the Scotch broom, Yaska's old nets. As the boy slid off her back, Kari bolted for the bivvy. The pungent odor of ammonia carbide, she knew it was the smell of her monthlies, even before she pulled up her dress and sat on the wooden ring. What to make of that thick, dark stain on her underwear, she wondered. She, a woman who's not had monthlies in over 5 years. Yaska didn't know socialism from rheumatism. The meetings in the socialist hall, what they talked about, he didn't know or much care. Not a hall fin, not a church fin. He kept to himself. His hump saw to that. It started as a knot of muscles that wouldn't unclamp, round like a steel trawl float, and anchored between the shoulder blades. It ached when the weather changed, when it rained, when the fogs rolled in thick. 30 years in the making, this hump, this reminder of a body bent by gravity. His hump provoked perfunctory sympathy from the elderly Finnish women, so sorry for him. Kindly jokes from the men, unguarded looks of fascination from the children, but not from the boy. He licked his index finger and traced the bulging outline, as if to say, there, or now. Yaska stood before the mirror and lifted his shirt. There, now. The hump was there. He turned sideways. Now it wasn't. A trick of his changing sight? Yaska arched his back, reached with his fingers. There, but just. He pulled his shoulders back. Always when he did this, its hot, searing pain stung from vertebrae to vertebrae. Now it didn't. Yaska dropped his shirt and began the longest letter he'd ever written to another. He wrote about how low-tide sunrise cooled in the litter of clamshells, how the boughs of the dug fir were sighs riddling the sky. Dawn painted the hemlock's rough bark umber, and dusk turned it maroon. He wrote of the freckled globes of the foxglove, how they held an interior life of their own. And yet for all this natural beauty, nothing, he wrote Mother, compared with that of their new lodger, a boy. Such a beautiful child and so light. When he carried him on his shoulders, he seemed to weigh less than Gunderson's sacks of meal or salt. And when he carried him on his shoulder, his back didn't ache a bit. His step was strong and sure. He had the strength of his youth. The boy had given him this, he wrote. Of Yaska's love for the boy, there is no limit. This is the enchantment of children. They reveal a capaciousness we didn't know we had. With the utmost care, he mixed flour and glue to make a mold of the boy's feet. For hours, he boiled leather to render it soft and supple. With infinite patience, he sewed strips of leather to fashion shoes with a long, firm tongue running from the heel to the calf. That the boy showed no interest in these proceedings bothered him not a bit. It was a kind of love to do for someone what they didn't know or care to be doing, washing, speaking gently, showing him the mesh and how to work the wooden tongue on the mesh board. And he loved to surprise the boy with gifts. He brought him floats from Soviet Russia and Japan and sweets of all sorts from Gunderson's, like double-salted black licorice, ribbon candy, and sticks of Corban. Who are you buying this all for? You got a girlfriend? Gunderson liked to joke, and Yaska, not a smiler by nature, could not help laughing. Yes, laughing. Though it was well into spring, the sky didn't know it yet. Darkness rained in long silver needles. Darkness rolled over clouds in thick tufts of storm. The wolves' anguished melodies knocked from hill to hill, tree to tree. The wolves are in the walls, Kari said to Jenny during her customary visit. The wolves make all this wind. At the sound of her voice, the boy, sitting in the metal tub, laughed and splashed about. She'd given up on him, left him there to bathe himself as he would, to dry and dress himself. No, Ginny said, it's him, and pointed to the boy. This is what happens when something is brought to a place where it shouldn't be. The boy, naked and dripping wet, sat now at the kitchen table, stroking the shiny scales of a salmon Yaska had been keeping alive. Spellbound, they watched his hands flick, flick, flick. His long fingernails, sharp as knives, flashed. Scales flew through the air. They could not take their eyes off of him, even as he boiled the fish, its body jackknifed in the water and its head sticking out of the pot. He ate it like that, one half of the fish cooked, the head still alive. At last Ginny spoke. If he were mine, I'd pour vinegar in his eyes. If he doesn't blink, then you'd know. Know what? Kari asked. If he's really a devil or not. That night Kari wrote to Mother, "What is happening to us, oh Mother? Collie's horse shattered Collie's ribs with a single kick. The crows have augured themselves into the windows of the canneries, driving their beaks into their brains. Each night the wolves come down from the hills and choir their sad canticles. We are changing, Mother." They awoke the next morning to bad news. All the milk at the dairy had gone on the blink, curdled even as the cows stood in their stanchions. The Chinese at the cannery were on strike. But it was the news about the 12 men lost at sea that put everyone on edge. From the Bible, Yaska read to the boy about storms and seas and Jesus who calmed such things, and Kari looked at the boy. In his eyes she discerned a preternatural coolness, a distance that suggested indeed they were of two separate worlds that were only just now intersecting. So for the sake of time, because it is a longer story, I'll just summarize a bit. Kari and Yaska have an argument over the boy, and Yaska throws her, kind of pushes her to the floor. She pretends to be more hurt than she really is, and has this realization that even though they're brother and sister, even though they're washed in two different waters, that's how separate they are and how they think about things. And so then she goes to get consoled, goes to see Ginny for some consolation, and when she gets there, she sees that Ginny is on the floor, and her face is in this big, massive, like, mud sludge. She's essentially drowned in mud. Now another letter from Mother. Every night, darkness knocks on my window. It wants to build a house inside of me, one splintered stick at a time. Like the tongue of a lock inside a door, gently, gently, darkness turns and lengthens, closes. I am quite shut in now. P.S. There is something wrong with the child, and I do not need his feet. What are you going to do? They agreed they'd take the boy to Seaside. They'd go early the next morning. They'd say they found him abandoned. They would say he was touched, one of God's symbols. Perhaps an orphanage in Portland would take him. Surely a child this beautiful would be adopted. Kari rose first. Night still slicked the undersides of the ferns, gloved each frond and blade. The cavilling of the owls wobbled low and ominous. She listened to Yaska and the boy breathing quietly beside each other. So beautiful, this boy. In the weak light, his skin seemed to glow translucent. Jenny was right. Better to put such creatures back where they came from. Mother, she would like to write, did Christ our Savior forgive us of every sin? And did he, Mother, forgive us of wrongdoing we knew we would commit and were not in the least bit sorry for? Kari bent over him, her shadow cloaking his body. She put her mouth near his, took in his sweet breath. His dark eyes snapped open. Mother, he said, and Kari fell back on her heels, scrambled down the stairs and out the door. When Yaska woke, the fire had burned to embers. He sat studying the liquid glow of the coals. Through the kitchen window, he could see the moon like a foam float, bobbing luminous on the dark water of the bay. In an hour, the water would swallow it. Dawn would break in a gray wash. Take me, pull me out or under, I'm ready. He'd tell the boy they were on a journey. They'd make a special visit for horehound candy. Be it right or wrong, a crime or an act of kindness, he would not let himself think. Boy, he called. The child liked to sleep, sometimes in the bathtub, sometimes under the bed. Boy! Yaska hoisted himself from the chair, up the stairs, down again, to the porch, to the yard. Boy! What new trouble he would or had already caused, this too he did not want to think about. Kari's voice rang in his ears. Do something. Kari groped through the waist-high sword fern, plodded along darkness. Nattering rattle, whickering wind, isn't this dark music her meat and milk? She'll put it on her tongue, swallow it down. That's what she'll write, Mother. The brittle fog gloving the trees, she'll write about that. And dawn, how it draws darkness to itself, neither a blessing nor a curse, it simply happens. Their only job is to navigate it. Near the top of the trail, Kari tripped over a root, caught herself on a bush, allowed herself to lie on a bed of moss, and watched the sky warm from pigeon gray to eggshell blue. All around her, green shoots of the bulb she'd planted knifed through the mossy sward. Kari rolled to her elbows and stood and peered over the cliff. The fog thinned to scraps of cloud, and the distillation of light through it radiant. A drawstring pulled on her abdomen. Wasn't that Yaska down on the flats? He'd not brought his thin planks to walk on or a pole for balance. Just Yaska, ankle deep in the marl. And the boy, his wild white hair danced in the wind. He hopped about in the mud, farther away from shore, farther from Yaska. Oh, you fool, she wanted to shout. Who is the child here? Take him to seaside or give him back to the water, for surely this land cannot abide him. Instead, she cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted Yaska's name. Tiny sandflies, sharp as grit, hurled themselves at his face. A litter of mussel shells slid open, glowing lavender, glistening like wet eyes. All that separates us from where we want to be is a bit of water, bits of glass. Mother wrote this in her last letter. We must walk on water, she wrote, walk into the light. And so light the silver glass, this water, so strong, surely he will walk on it. Before him, in the shallow surf, the child stood, rising through the flattened silver, a fulmination of his every dream, so perfect and perfectly meeting him. Yaska's feet moved of their own accord, carrying him closer to the child. The flats shone like a mirror. The child stood gazing at him, brilliant light everywhere. Only then did Yaska notice the child cast no shadow. Oh, what, Mother? Oh, what would you say about that? And the child beckoned with a hand, urging him into the water. And then a voice sharp and shrill from the heights, Yaska, don't! A dark crease, a crumple to the light, that voice. At the sound of it, he shook his head, as if it were like these flies, mere irritants. Yaska took another step toward the boy. The water lapped at the boy's knees, then his thighs, his waist. The water lapped at Yaska's ankles, his shins. The trick, Mother wrote, to walking on water has to do with faith. I'm blind, quite blind now, and I can tell you this with certainty. You close your eyes and you keep walking. Dizzy with light and blinded by the glare off the sand, Yaska walked with the hesitant, toddling steps of a small child. How far would faith take him? A game, a trick. The child, now past the safety buoy, was playing with him, beckoning him, pretending to be caught in the net, then jumping free, splashing and calling gaily. He'd not figured the boy would be so quick and agile in water, but just as he was about to grasp something solid, say an arm or a leg, the boy swam beyond his reach. Not a good game, not with the tide coming in. Yaska waded further. The water heaved. The boy plummeted, then reappeared, not smiling now, but thrashing and flailing. It seemed he really was tangled in the net. Father, he cried, his voice thin and spectral, save me. Hang on, Yaska called, even as another swell lifted and dragged the boy under. Yaska! Kari's voice again, this time much closer. Yaska turned. She was setting planks, a rope over her shoulder. Help him, Yaska called. She had the strength of 3 women now. The boy had given her that. She could give the rope to him, he knew. Throw! He hollered, pointing to where the boy's head crested briefly, then vanished. Kari looked at the child, gasping and choking, and at her brother, mired thigh-deep in the mud. Oh, Mother, 1 rope and 2 in peril. Is it a sin to let go the one you shouldn't have? Kari set another plank. One end of the rope she tied around her waist, the other she lassoed. She looped as a lasso. She had lost Bucky because he wanted to be lost. She had lost her child because he was never hers to have. The boy in the water, he wasn't hers either, but Yaska, to his hips now in the mud, was a different matter. For what she was about to do, he would not forgive her. That would be her burden to bear. But it's a kind of love to do what must be done because no one else can or will. and it's a kind of love to let go. Kari swung the lasso once, twice. On 3 she let it sail where it landed true. Impervious to his noise, his threats, his anguish, Kari cinched the rope tight, and hand over hand, she started the long haul.
Are there any authors or works that you think inspired you with the story that you read?
Yes, I'm really interested in Kelly Link's work. She writes fabulous magic realism and sometimes even kind of science fiction types of short stories. I like her work very much. I love Angela Carter's works, particularly how she will take an old fairy tale we think we know and totally turn it on its head. Just kind of, she's using the same plot lines and structures, but then she'll go in and maybe work through a different protagonist and explore all the cracks in the story in a fairy tale that just had never been filled in. She'll go in there and fill them in. And it's really a lot of fun how she does that. And her prose is so gorgeous. It's really lyrical.
At the beginning, you talked about the research you were doing in Oregon, and I'm trying to imagine how it relates with, how it gets articulated through fiction. I was just wondering if you could talk about that relationship a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I'm an odd kind of a researcher because I don't have a really good methodology. I just kind of go bumbling in and force jump it and just start asking people really ridiculous questions. But people will say amazing things. So I thought of Astoria as being primarily a logging town, and there certainly was quite a large logging series of logging outfits in the Astoria area and all up and down in the coastal range of Oregon. But really, the canneries, where the fishing was what drove industry in Astoria for many, many years. And I did not realize how many Finnish people lived in Astoria until I went to an antique store and saw all these old photos that Finnish families had left because no one in the family could take them. And I was asking the owner, who are all these people? And where are these families now? And he's like, you can tell from what they're wearing in the photos with their fins. And so he told me all about how Astoria was at one time in the 30s, I believe, called Fin Town because there were so many Finns working the woods and gill netting. And some in the canneries, but mostly Chinese packing in the canneries. So it was really interesting to think that, for me to discover, I thought I understood a little bit about the history of this town because my dad had lived there and told me some things. And then really there's all this other history. And then there's some really dark things that happen in Astoria that don't show up here. This is pretty light and sweet. But there were other things. And then everyone has a ghost story because there's so many people that perished there where the Columbia River dumps into the Pacific Ocean, where the two tides are meeting. It's just very, very perilous. So, yeah, it was really exciting to do some of the research.
Yes. So you said with your research, sometimes people say these really amazing things. So what kind of amazing things are you looking for when you talk to people for your research?
Yeah, sometimes it's really subtle things. I went into a shop that sold china and linens, and there were 2 women working behind the counter. And I just, sort of what I do is, I research is I just sort of hang around in the back and eavesdrop. I do a lot of eavesdropping. But I went up to the counter and just asked about something. Like there was a mug that said VELTA on it. I was like asking about it. I like VELTA. It's a nice thing to say when you can't think of anything else. And the one woman, she said, yeah, I got a lot of UFTA stuff. Is anybody here like Norwegian or Swedish? UFTA? It's kind of like an expletive, but not quite as bad as some other expletives. It's like, it's appropriate if you drop a hammer on your foot. That's an UFTA moment. So I'm talking to her about UFTA, or whatever, and she's Swedish. I divine that she's Swedish. And the woman next to her is getting this real prickly look on her face. And she says it's such a dumb expression. We Finns don't say that. We say, oh. And I realized these two women co-owned the store, which is why everything was neatly divided in half. All the Finnish ware was on one side, and all the Swedish stuff was on the other side. And they got into this argument over like who was better, Finns or Swedes, who was cleaner, whose weddings were better, which China was better, which China was more popular. And I was like, wow, I really hit a gold mine here. So, yeah, I just kind of have become, made it a habit to ask oddball questions. I went to the chiropractor. I knew I wanted to write about a family that either ran a funeral home or somebody in the family was part of that industry. And I said to her, I said, gee, do you know anybody who knows anything about, about undertaking and that whole industry? And she says, she's cracking my back, and she's like, pop, 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 pop. I said, why, yes, my mother was a chief embalmer for over 45 years in North New Jersey. I said, and me and my twin sister, we grew up and we ran it out of our home. And so all the work happened in the basement, and our living room was actually a chapel. So it's funny, if you ask a question, people have all kinds of things that they'll share.
Do you have any personal ghost stories that possibly inspired your work?
Yes, I do. I can share one. Otherwise, I'd be here all night. But I was really close to my grandpa. I hadn't been close to him for most of my childhood, but about a year before he died, we just got to be buddies. It's kind of, I don't know how it happened, but we just kind of did. My grandparents lived about 3 blocks away from us. They would often come over for dinner. And it just, I think he saw that I was no longer a child but a human being because I was now like 17. And he just didn't know what to do with kids. And so we kind of became buddies. We'd go and I'd pick him up and we'd go places and he'd come over and he loved music. He'd play the piano, so he'd come and play our piano for us. And so he passed away very suddenly. On the first day I went off to school, I got a phone call from the president's office to come to the office. And it was my dad telling me that Grandpa had been delivering parts and had stopped in at a parts depot, sat down, had a heart attack, and died in a chair, just like that. And I was really, really, really upset because I didn't have a chance to say goodbye. And that really bothered me. So a couple months later, I'm driving on the freeway, and it's really coming down really hard. And I look over, and there's a car beside me, and it's him. He's in the car. And he's just looking at me, and I can see him. And I thought, well, that's pretty weird. Grief does things to people. I had been told expect stuff like that. But then about 6 months later, it happened again. Same place in the freeway. And I look over, there he is. This time, his mouth is moving. He's trying to tell me something. So then probably a year has gone by. My grandma, his wife, is pretty sick, and it looks like she's not going to be with us much longer. But I'm outside the little cafe. It's a hot day. I'm sitting there, and I'm working on my Russian homework. I'm totally into, conjugating verbs, just totally engrossed. And I see out of the corner of my eye this elderly gentleman kind of shuffling past me. And I don't look at him carefully, but I'm listening to the shuffle. And as he goes by, I look at him, and I know it's him because he had that walk. He shuffled like that. And he had this big hump on his back. There's a hump. And I said, Grandpa, wait. And he turns just a little bit like this. I can see the side of his face, but not all the way. And he starts shuffling again. And I close my book, throw it on my back. I'm going to run after him. and he's gone around the alley. I run down the alley and he's gone. I absolutely know it was him. So that's 3 visits. So I go off to graduate school, and my instructor's name is Ray Youngbear, and we're taking a class on fiction that often it was just talking, we were just telling stories. And he had a lot of like really cool paranormal stories and ghost stories. So I'm taking his class, and I keep having these dreams. My grandma has since died. I'm having these dreams that my grandpa keeps visiting me, and he has something really important to tell me. 3 times he comes and he tells me, Gina, you have to forgive her. So I had a really difficult relationship with her. 3 times, same thing. So I go to Ray Youngbear. I tell him about the 3 sightings. I tell him about these 3 messages. They're all the same. I said, what should I do? And he said, well, do what he says. You have to forgive her. However you're going to do that, you got to do it. I said, but she's dead. He said, it doesn't matter. You have to forgive her. But just say it out loud. However you're going to do it, you have to forgive her, because she can't be happy, because she's being held by your anger and resentment. I thought, oh, okay, all right. So I did. We did. I haven't seen either of them ever since, dreams or anywhere else.
I got so tense towards the end of your story that I felt I couldn't hold my body properly. And I wondered if you ever had that experience writing. Do you get into the work physically? Is the way you describe actions is so physical. And so much of what you're describing is hauling or fishing.
Yeah, well, it gives me a headache. I mean, oh, what should happen next? Oh, we gotta get this thing moving along. Yeah, but kind of, yeah, in my mind, and sometimes, and I know my kids think I'm nuts, but sometimes you have to physically work it out. Okay, how far away are they from the fireplace? How does this work, you know? How would you describe that? What are the right verbs, precise verbs for that action? Yeah. But mostly it just gives me a headache, because it's hard work, isn't it, writing? You writers, you know. It's like, oh, you just gotta get the precise word. It can't be like almost precise. It's gotta be the right word. It's gotta not just sound right, but it's gotta be right in the configuration of all the other ones around them. If anything's off and it's wrong, it'll sound weird. The rhythm has to be right. And there's a lot to think about, isn't there? Yeah. No wonder writers train. Yes.
So you were talking a little bit about your thought process when writing. So what's your kind of thought process when you're planning a story? Like how many details do you like to plan ahead versus just kind of going with the flow?
I'm so colossally disorganized. I'm not a planner. I'm just not. I can't, if I could show you the first 5 drafts, what you would see is stuff on receipts, post notes, napkins. I mean, it's just photographs, stuff all over the place. And then maybe I'll start blocking it out on a whiteboard just to get a sense of what might the major segments be or look like, or if there's a scene where will that happen. But in the initial stages, I'm real old-fashioned. I write everything out, and then I just kind of start moving the post-it notes around. Not organized.
Thank you so much. It was really exciting to hear new work, especially, and brave. So thank you for sharing with us. Gina's books are on sale, so please mosey on over.